Welcome to Wine, Whiskey, and Song, where we explore the connections we make with wine, with whiskey, and with music. Here's Andy Wesley and Tom Roper. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our next episode of Wine, Whiskey, and Song. I'm Andy Wesley. This is Tom Roper. We're talking about whiskey, and today we're going to talk about the second element in the creation of all whiskeys, which is fermentation. A reminder from what we talked about with fermentation in our wine episode. Fermentation is yeast eating sugar to form alcohol. In our last whiskey episode, we talked about the fact that grains, which is the raw material for whiskey, does not have sugar in it. It has starch in it, and that starch needs to be converted to sugar through a process called mashing before we get to fermentation. Once we get to fermentation, we take our wort, which is a sugary liquid that is the grain converted to starch converted to sugar in water, and we add yeast to that process to start fermentation. Fermentation actually happens in two different stages. The first of which is called aerobic respiration. And in the aerobic respiration part of fermentation, the yeast is actually rapidly multiplying. And one of the things that happens is most of the yeast that distillers use for the purposes of fermentation is a very, very controllable yeast, because we want to know exactly what that yeast is going to do. Sometimes in wine fermentations, we talk about natural yeast in the process and just letting fermentation start naturally. In distillation, most of the time, we want that fermentation to do exactly what it is that we want it to do. So we're going to use a controlled, inoculated yeast. So once the yeast enters the washback, the fermentation chamber, it's going to rapidly multiply. At some point, that yeast is going to use up all of the oxygen available and then start an anaerobic respiration process, which is actually the process where the yeast eats the sugar to form alcohol. And then one of the byproducts of anaerobic fermentation is carbon dioxide. So we end up at the end of fermentation with a lot of carbon dioxide, and fermentation tends to also throw off a lot of heat. So if you've ever been in a situation, Tommy, you've ever been someplace where fermentation is happening?
Oh yeah.
You can smell it, right?
Distillery tours
and
such,
it's warm.
Yeah.
And they'll tell you if you're on a distillery tour, don't stick your head down into the washback because you'll literally just be breathing carbon dioxide.
Yeah,
there's no oxygen left at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of whiskey, a lot of distilled spirits, all we're really looking for is the yeast to eat the sugar and form a certain amount of ethanol. Mm-hmm. Once fermentation is complete, fermentation usually takes about 48 hours for all of the yeast to convert the sugar into alcohol. And we've got as much ethanol as we're going to get, which is around 7 or 8% when we're talking about whiskey. And at the end of that process, we would have something that we might call beer, right? Beer is the fermented mash of grains. Now, one of the interesting things about fermentation is creating congeners. Fermentation is creating flavor during that process. Distillation doesn't really create flavor. We'll talk about distillation next time, but all of the flavors that we're going to isolate during distillation are actually created during fermentation, or at least a vast majority of them. And one of the particular types of flavor that you get from fermentation, if you allow it to last long enough, are fruity aromas. You ever smelled a whiskey and you actually smell fruit? There's no fruit going into that process. Okay, you'll get with this Glenfarclas 105, which is a cask strength whiskey, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But there's actually a lot of fruit aromas in this: orange, citrus, lemon, apple. Mm-hmm. Those fruit aromas come from acids coming in contact with alcohols during fermentation and creating something called esters. Now, I have to throw a quick shout out because Tom's wife has a band, and what's the name of it?
Ester. E-S-T-E-R.
E-S-T-E-R, Esther,
Exactly,
which is
esters.
a woman's name. It is also these particular flavor components that are created
Yeah.
with an acid coming in contact with alcohol. And the way that those flavors are created is by allowing fermentation to last beyond that 48-hour period. So 48 hours it takes the yeast to eat the sugar to form alcohol, and then the yeast cells die. And as they die and start to break apart, they're releasing acids, and those acids bond with the alcohol that's been created and actually create fruity aromas that we call esters.
Wow, okay.
This is a very similar process to if you're familiar with rum at all. There are, high ester rums from Jamaica that are made, in like dunder and muck pits where they allow these, acids to remain in contact with alcohols and create esters. So
Interesting. Okay.
usually those fruity aromas that you find in a whiskey are either coming from ester creation, which is about allowing fermentation to last beyond 48 hours, or they're coming from the wood, which we'll talk about in our maturation episode. So the whiskey that we're going to taste today is an interesting whiskey because of the fact that not only is it a very good single malt whiskey from Glenfarclas, but this is their 105, which is a cask strength whiskey. So this whiskey is bottled at 60% ABV. And Tom and I actually did a little experimenting before we turned the cameras on, because for most people, 60% ABV is much too much alcohol for you really to get a chance to taste something. So, Tom, that first glass is actually just cask strength Glenfarclas 105 at 60% alcohol. And if any of you happen to have a cask strength whiskey in front of you, whether it's Glenfarclas 105 or another, if you stick your nose in that glass and breathe in, your nose burns. There's like a, alcohol. One of the ways that our body senses alcohol is it's a pain receptor. Okay, it's literally you're noticing heat.
Yes.
So if you taste that cask strength whiskey, there's also quite a bit of burn on the palate, and it's hard for us to identify all the aromas and flavors at that particular level. Now, Tom had mentioned you tend to like cask strength whiskeys, at higher ABVs. And so what we did was we diluted the cask strength with about half as much water as the amount of spirit in the glass, in essence lowering this ABV down to closer to 40%. And when you smell it again, you get a lot more spice and fruit aromas, and you can actually smell the whiskey without just all of that alcohol.
Yep.
Now, as we talked about, the other thing that's happening when you add water to a cask strength whiskey is you're releasing oils, you're releasing things in the whiskey that weren't necessarily available with all of that alcohol. So we actually did this experiment once before, but I'm going to walk this glass over to the camera so you can see this glass close up and watch what happens to that liquid when I add some water. You actually see the whiskey cloud up a little bit, and those oils are getting released as the water is diluting the spirit. So something to keep in mind if you're tasting particularly cask strength whiskeys. I was tasting a Highland Park cask strength last Saturday, which was bottled at 63.5% ABV, and you put your nose in that glass and it was possible to sort of get anything except that heat prickle and the heat. So what do you taste when you're tasting this Glenfarclas?
Well, certainly the cask strength, I taste certainly a lot of alcohol on the cask strength, which it's like cask strength and Here's a weird one. Banana?
Yeah, and that's actually one of those esters. One of the things that, for those of you who drink Belgian ales, there's a lot of times there's a real banana component there. That's a particular ester that's created during fermentation, and in this particular case, the distillation process is going to take all of the flavor that fermentation has created and either isolate it or sort of turbocharge it, because we're separating liquids at that point. One of the interesting things that I was reading not long ago, which is sort of fascinating, is that the amount of ethanol, pure ethanol, in a spirit, percentage-wise, is still relatively low. The congeners are still relatively low. So the amount of ethanol and water, those congeners are less than 1% of the total makeup of the whiskey. And yet you have all of these different flavor components, to your point, banana, and there's a, there's a lot of really interesting fruit flavors here and fruit aromas. Then you get what the Scottish would call, some like Christmas cake and, dried fruits and things like that, which comes from the fact that, there's some sherry cask aging here. Okay. But it's just talking about fermentation, those fruit aromas are created by allowing fermentation to last longer. I think Glenfarclas, their fermentations are 72 hours or longer, so an extra full day to allow those esters to be created before we're stopping fermentation, capturing the liquid, filtering out all of the yeast, etc., and then just in Scotland, just the liquid will move on to distillation. In bourbon production, a lot of times they're taking the yeast cells and the solids that are in that liquid, and that's moving on to distillation as well. The other thing that we have is we have a little bit of Woodford Reserve here left over from the last episode, and the two things that I wanted to point out in comparison here. First of all, you look at the difference in color.
Oh yeah,
remember the Woodford
really
is
dark.
the Woodford is in new charred oak barrels, and the Glenfarclas is in all used barrels.
Used
and then
sherry in this case, I think. Yep.
And then when you smell both of them, there's a lot more wood tones and things like that in the bourbon.
Yes.
And a lot more complexity of flavor, a lot more fruit, a lot more spice in the Scotch whiskey. So what questions do you have about anything either to do with fermentation or with that idea of why it's important, particularly with cask strength whiskeys, to dilute them a little bit?
So the yeast. I've heard of that there are strains of yeast, and certainly in beer production, they pay a lot of attention to the strain of yeast they use to ferment for beer. Is that also the case for whiskey? Do they all use kind of the same strain, or is that
they use very similar strains because keep in mind that from a beer perspective, we're basically going to create whatever flavor is going to be created during fermentation, and then we're going to drink it. Okay?
Yeah.
With whiskey, I like to think of whiskey is what happens to beer when it reaches its full potential, which is after distillation. Distillation is going to remove and isolate certain flavors, and then we're going to put this whiskey in a barrel, and about 60% or 70% of the flavor is actually going to come from the interaction with the barrel. So what we're interested in a vast majority of the time when we talk about fermentation for a distilled spirit is just control. And so we use the same yeast all the time. From distillery to distillery, they use very similar yeasts. They might not be exactly the same, but similar strains, so that we can make sure that we're extracting as much alcohol as possible. And then flavor profile and flavor changes are determined by the length of that fermentation, by allowing that fermentation to go on past 48 hours. Now, is that to say that the yeast strain that Glenfarclas uses is exactly the same as the yeast strain that, Lafroig uses in Islay? Not necessarily, but we want something that's going to be very consistent so that we can extract as much flavor as possible. So there certainly is not as much yeast strain variation as there would be in beer production, because in beer production we're actually creating all of our flavor based on the type of barley that we're using and the yeast strain that we're using, right? Because those are the only real inputs. Remember that a vast majority of the inputs for whiskey happen after fermentation. The flavors are created during fermentation. The flavors for the actual spirit, the spirit, and then we're going to put that spirit into a still and turbocharge certain flavors and get rid of certain flavors with the distillation process, separation of liquids, which we'll talk about next time. And then we're going to put that whiskey into a barrel where a vast majority of the flavor comes from. So yeast strain is certainly less important in the yeast strain variation is certainly less important in whiskey production than it is in the production of beer, as an example.
Now onto the cask strength concept. So I think we've all kind of heard of the maybe we haven't heard of what's called the angel share. You go on a distillery tour in Scotland, they tell you angel share, and they put it in a cask, and certainly a certain amount of evaporation happens.
Yep.
And the alcohol level from distillation to when they pull it out of the cask, depends on how many years, that the percentage goes down. And I always thought that was just true across the board for alcohols.
Yeah, so
you told me something interesting earlier about this.
In Scotland, remember that when we're aging something in Scotland, the climate in Scotland is cool, relatively consistent, year round, and humid, as opposed to the climate in Kentucky or Tennessee, which is very hot and dry, and there are big temperature fluctuations.
Yeah.
So the liquid that goes into a barrel in Scotland, when it comes out of the barrel, it is actually at a lower ABV than it was when it went in. Because the angel share in Scotland is higher in ethanol than it is in water. Because it's so much warmer in Kentucky and so much drier, you're actually seeing more water evaporation than you are the rate of ethanol evaporation. So in Kentucky and Tennessee, something goes into a barrel and the ABV actually goes up.
That's wild. You told me that, and I thought about I have this bottle of Wild Turkey cask strength at home that my mother-in-law gave me. They had toured the distillery there, and it is a rocket.
Yeah.
It is, and I didn't understand dilution and how that should work until today. Really understand it.
Yeah, and there the ABV is actually going up. So whatever they distilled it to, which is, remember in bourbon production, the maximum proof is 160 proof. Okay, so 80% ABV.
Okay.
A lot of the top producers are actually producing to a much lower ABV than that because they want to keep that flavor. And then also remember that a vast majority of whiskeys are diluted before they go into the barrel. So they are adding water before it goes into the barrel. But then in Kentucky, that water is evaporating faster than the alcohol is. Now in Scotland, a vast majority of the whiskey, and we'll talk about this more when we get into barrel maturation, but a vast majority of the whiskey in Scotland goes into the barrel at 63.5% ABV. And part of the reason for that is because in Scotland there's a tradition for years because of blended whiskey. Remember, blended whiskey is about 90% of the volume of what comes out of Scotland. Only about 10% of it is single malt. So when you make a blended whiskey, you take several different single malts and blend them together with a grain whiskey. So what the single malt distilleries will do is they will trade barrels back and forth, and to make sure that I'm giving you something that's roughly the equivalent of what you're giving me. Everything is diluted to 63.5% before it goes into the barrel.
Oh, wow.
So a vast majority of distilleries, their products going into the barrel at 63.5% to make it easy to trade. Now, I do not know, because this Glenfarclas is 60% ABV, if with this one item it's actually going into the barrel at a little bit higher ABV, because if this went into the barrel at 63.5%, it's also going to give us an idea about approximately how old the whiskey is, how long it was in the barrel, because it only has between 63.5 and 60 to drop. So I would assume that this may have gone into the barrel at slightly higher than 63.5%.
Okay.
So we covered a couple of different things today. First of all, we covered fermentation. And remember, from a whiskey perspective, fermentation takes those raw materials and creates some lift, actually creates the bedrock that we're going to use to lay all of our flavors and all of our other components on top of. Our musical reference to fermentation is chord progression, which does the same thing. Chord progression allows the melody and the lyrics to sit on top of that chord progression and creates a somewhat repetitive structure that we can then use to build melody and lyrics on top of. Yeah. And so when we talk about the song that we're going to play today, which we'll talk about in just a minute, because I want to remind everybody we also talked about that cask strength thing and, diluting your cask strength whiskey to actually give you a better opportunity to taste it. So I don't want to lose sight of that. But the topic of today's session was supposed to be about fermentation and that bedrock that we're creating. Right. So why don't you tell everybody a little bit about the song that we're going to play today and about the chord progression of this song.
So what's interesting about this particular song is it is mainly a standard 1-4-5 progression, what we call the 1-4-5. So it's the chords are G, C, and D, and that's it's in the key of G. So it's the one that's the root of the song. It's the foundation. It's kind of what holds everything together and gives you a frame of reference. And then, but it moves through these chords a little bit more quickly and rhythmically, which is gives it that variation that keeps your standard GCD song or your standard 1-4-5 song, which there's probably 100,000 songs out there that are based on the 1-4-5 progression.
Yep.
Gives it that variation. And this song is by a band called Fountains of Wayne. If you don't recognize the name, you probably know them through the song Stacy's Mom. Everyone knows the song Stacy's Mom, which is, they are the masters of the pop song and taking relatively simple chord progressions, but turning the song into something that is just, it's catchy, it'll stick in your head, it's an earworm, but the foundation of the songs, no one's ever going to accuse Fountains of Wayne of being a prog rock band like Rush or Pink Floyd.
Sure.
Certainly, just the foundation is simple, straightforward, used in similar to whiskeys, similar yeasts, similar grains, used across the industry, but to call it an industry, I hate to do that, but it's just we're kind of touching on that human element and what they've done on top of that makes it just catchy and fun and great to listen to.
Sure. So now we're going to play you Hey Julie by Fountains of Wayne, and we'll be back with another episode soon to talk about distillation, which is what happens after fermentation and where we really separate fermented beverages like beer and wine from distilled spirits in that step. And then we'll do one more episode after that talks about maturation. So cheers to all of you. We'll see you again soon.
Cheers.
Working all day for a mean little man with a clip-on tie and a rub-on tan. He's got me running around the office like a dog around a track. When I get back home, you're always there to rub my back. Hey, Julie, look what they're doing to me, trying to trip me up, trying to wear me down. Julie, I swear it's so hard to bear it, and I never make it through without you around. No, I never make it through without you around. Hours on the phone making pointless calls. I got a desk full of paper that means nothing at all. Sometimes I catch myself staring into space, counting down the hours till I get to see your face. Hey Julie, look what they're doing to me, trying to trip me up, trying to wear me down. Julie, I swear it's so hard to bear it, and I never make it through without you around. No, I never make it through without you around. How did it come to be? You and I must be far away from each other every day. How must I spend my time filling up my mind with facts and figures that never add up anyway? They never add up anyway. Working all day for a mean little guy with a bad toupee and a soup-stained tie. He's got me running around the office like a gerbil on a wheel. He can tell me what to do, but he can tell me what to feel. Hey Julie, look what they're doing to me, trying to trip me up, trying to wear me down. Julie, I swear it's so hard to bear it, and I never make it through without you around. No, I never make it through without you around. No, I never make it through without you around.
Cheers.
Cheers. See you next time.
Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon with another episode of Wine, Whiskey, and Song. In the meantime, please like the video and leave any comments you have. And of course, subscribe to our channel.